All right, so my name is Jesse, and I'm the lead on the Conservation Stories Canada project. Over the last few weeks, I've had the distinct pleasure of interviewing 10 other people across the country, featuring stories of pollinators, birds, reptiles, and wildlife corridors, all sorts of really neat, unique stories. But today I wanted to go a little bit bigger and feature the big picture. And so today with me, I've got James Paget. He is the Species at Risk Biodiversity Specialist for the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And I want to say a huge thank you, James, for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to talk with you.
Awesome. Well, what does that job entail on a day-by-day basis? So you're saving species, you're protecting biodiversity. What does that actually look like every day for you?
Yeah, that's a big question because there's not really a standard job description depending on who you ask, I think, for what that job title is. But and we've had that discussion, like that thinking in our own organizations, like, what does it mean? And if we've it really touches on a lot of aspects of conservation work. CWF, we work on freshwater, on marine species, terrestrial and airborne species, and really kind of sadly, I guess, species at risk touch really every one of those. And then the tie-in with biodiversity, is that we want to take care of species that aren't yet at risk to make sure that they stay that way. And it's a lot more work and often less successful to recover a species than it is to prevent it from becoming at risk in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, and on a day-to-day basis, it really depends on the time of year. Right now being January, there's a lot of planning and planning for field work, funding applications to be able to carry out this critical stuff that happens in the field season, and a lot of partnership building. That's not to say I spend my winters inside, but I'm outside as much as I can, just not as much with field work. Yeah. And so spring does come pretty quickly in this line of work as we're planning and realizing how quick the field season comes, and then field season, spring through into fall, and for me anyway, there's a lot of researchers that work in the winter as well. I'm helping to manage our turtle conservation work, working on bat recovery, contributing to and teaching a whole lot about iNaturalist Canada. That's some of the things that I'm doing.
And we're going to touch upon a bit of that as we go through the interview. That's fantastic. And so, we talked about the fact that there are more species at risk than we'd like. And as a major wildlife federation, your job is to help protect those species, to, protect those habitats. And there's limited money, there's limited time. How do you prioritize species that you choose or areas that you choose to protect? Is there a sort of calculus behind this that you guys use as an organization?
Yeah, there's definitely thinking, and we have experts in various fields of conservation. So we do target specific species, and like I said, it really depends. Like, do you focus on preventing a species from becoming at risk, which means probably it's easier to do or more successful, or do you focus on something that's already extremely at risk that may be lost if we don't do anything about it? So we're trying to do a mix of both. Yep. And a lot of our work, what we do is focus on our field of expertise, and we also look at what other organizations are doing. Like, we don't want to duplicate efforts. We want to make sure that we don't try and do the same thing someone else is doing, so that they can leave them to do the great work they are, and we can do something else and fill a different need.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear you say that. And this is something that's been touched upon in a lot of the interviews, is this cross collaboration between organizations, governments, individuals, NGOs across the country, in making sure that we touch upon as many areas as possible in saving this widest possible array of species. And so how are we doing as a country? You have this, again, this amazing broad view. Are we doing a good job? Has there been certainly for me, there's been a big consciousness shift that I've seen in youth and the general public to understand the value of ecosystems and species much more broadly. So are we seeing that translate into positive impacts for species conservation across the country?
So it takes a long time to recover a species. Yes. Species are long-lived. So, even if there's a shift, there's a lag time, right, before we see those results. But, I wish I could say things are better here in Canada for wildlife than they are. There's over 800 species at risk listed or assessed as to be at risk of extinction, and very few are recovered at this point. And as I said, it takes a long time and a lot of effort to do that, which is one of the reasons. There's with this many species at risk and the lack of recovery, I'd like to see things improving a lot more than they are.
Yeah.
Now there are as you said, a shift of renewed focus and some really great local success stories and initiatives and amazing people that are protecting and conserving wildlife.
Yeah.
And this has really made sure that we haven't lost some of the species that have otherwise gone extinct. Because if we hadn't done these things, we may be faced with a lot more extinct species than we have. But on the whole, a lot of species do continue to decline, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, it's no use being a Pollyanna about these sort of things. These are serious issues. There are a lot of species under threat, and it's a difficult conversation to have. But again, that's why these sort of rules exist. That's why these organizations are doing the work that they're doing, and it is very important. And it's important to highlight that there is a problem to begin with. Otherwise, why get behind something if there isn't a problem to help tackle? You did, however, mention success stories. And so some of us might know things like the whooping crane, which we've heard about, certainly on an international scale. Mountain gorillas have increased in population. Is there a success story we can point to in Canada and say, wow, this is a really great example of what we can do when we put our minds to it?
Yeah, there are. I mean, yeah, there's several successful reintroductions. There have been bison reintroduced in some areas of Canada. There have been the whooping crane, black-footed ferret in the prairie region, although that was a lot more complicated because the prey species of the ferret was also a species at risk. So it shows how complicated some of these things are. But there's the trouble is to find the main threat to these species, and often the main threat is habitat loss or human impacts. So when we can address the threat, then we can really make a difference. A good example of a simple threat was the ban and reduction of DDT back in the 80s. Like that made a huge difference for species at risk. So if we can find something that's straightforward enough that we can deal with, that's a great success story. But the problem is these threats and risks are so intertwined and often related to habitat loss, which we can't just magically recreate.
Yeah.
So it really requires it requires a mind shift and a value shift for people to put this priority back on habitat conservation and these real kind of humanity type shifts of how we live.
Which are harder to implement, but it's something that, again, I think that we are starting to see this. You look at marches of 1 million kids around the world in support of climate. This is in all the last couple of years. I think a lot of people assumed my generation would be the one to sort of lead the charge on this, and instead it's the 16-year-olds and younger that are really doing a lot of this work. But habitat loss as a topic, I'm really excited that this is something that is slowly but surely getting into people's minds, because it's not just saving a species, it's saving the area that it lives in. If you send the species that you reintroduce back into the burning building, it's no good for anybody. And I'm so glad you touched upon ferrets and prairie dogs. It's something I'm really keen to cover in later interviews over the course of the year. So speaking of this consciousness shift, speaking of this interest in nature, as a young man, I've read a lot about the fact that you were really keen on getting outdoors. You still are keen on getting outdoors. What was your experience like? Like, how did you end up in this role? What was the inspiration to you to help protect wildlife and habitats?
Yeah, as you said, I've always been interested in the outdoors. I grew up, in the country and had access to go play in the woods and go hiking and go camping with my family. So yeah, that really had a big impact, and I feel I can sense that from my kids that that's really becoming part of their lives, and they're already shaping up to know and appreciate a lot about the natural world. But it's interestingly, biology wasn't my first career choice. Actually, I was also really into sports as a kid, and I ended up studying sports therapy, so like sports physio, and it was a great career. But for me, there's just kind of something missing for when I started in on this career, and ironically, to pay for my university, I was out in the wilderness in northern parts of Canada planting trees to pay for this, and I always kind of felt myself drawn, maybe unconsciously from my childhood upbringing and experiences, that I was still drawn back into wanting to do something more with nature and being outside. And so from there, I went back to school in biology and made that career change, and I've really never regretted it. It was a great decision for me.
Well, I can say on behalf of Canada, we're really glad you did. Not that the other career wouldn't have been great, but you've done some really top-notch work in this. And, you talk about your own experience getting out in nature, exploring it, and how that impacted you. And one of the things that you've done such an amazing job of at the Canadian Wildlife Federation is making sure that so many other Canadians are excited about getting out in nature and seeing it. And so I don't want to steal the thunder by talking about all the projects, but can you explain a little bit about what some of the projects that you've spearheaded are at the Federation and how they, the successes of them and getting so many Canadians excited about the natural world?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to, I feel like, people care about what they connect with, or what they can connect with, and are willing to make sacrifices and stand up for what they care about. And really, at this point, the planet needs this. So, connecting people to nature and is a big part of that. So without people knowing what's out there in the backyards, in our parks, even growing on the sides of our sidewalks, we can't connect with it. So some of the work that I've been doing involving getting people outside and through Bioblitzes and the use of iNaturalist Canada is to kind of help make that link to what people are seeing, or to notice, I guess, what's around them, what people are seeing. We've heard a lot about that, I feel like, in the global pandemic, where people are starting to notice things that are around their neighborhoods, around their houses. And, it's a bit of, maybe there are a few animals or other species around because of, we're not out as much. But I think it's also because people are just starting to take notice because we're home and we have the time and we're making that effort to notice. And so, the part of the other aspect of that is in Bioblitzes and getting people out, and they might realize that there are way more species living somewhere than they ever could imagine. A Bioblitz that gets people outside and exploring their natural space, even if it's in their backyard, they can just get a sense of there's more things there that are worth conserving and worth protecting. I remember, before I learned how to identify plants, I'd see a bunch of trees and other things there. But now, like, when I go into a forest or a system, I can see like there's hundreds of individual species there, and it just really makes that ecosystem kind of come alive.
Yeah. You mentioned iNaturalist, and I love that this has been brought up in a few of the conversations. You've been unarguably Canada's leader in encouraging people to use this as a platform. So for me, I got the chance to use it last August, and through the use of this app, which we'll explain more about in a second, birds in my neighborhood used to be, I just thought of them as that pretty bird. Now it's a red-breasted nuthatch, and that's a big shift in your mind. Or you hear a bird call and you record it and you can send it to iNaturalist, and now I know that's what a blue jay sounds like, which I'd actually ironically never actually seen a blue jay make that call, but now I'm so excited about it. I become a birder is the moral of the story based on this. And seeing the trees for the forest, as you mentioned, that there's so many species out there. So iNaturalist, if someone's never heard of this before, what is it, how do you use it, and why are you such a fan?
Oh, it's like, imagine like you're curious, you're walking around, you're like, oh, what's that plant, or what's this bug that just landed beside my window? It's in your hand. You can actually take a photo of it, and the app, or uploading it to the iNaturalist.ca afterwards, will give you a suggestion of what that species is. And it's just an extra way to get that deeper connection. It's like, it's no longer just a bug at my window. It's like, oh, this is a black swallowtail butterfly. And it just adds that extra level of like, an understanding and connection with what it is. On top of it, it gives people a way to contribute to science, because all this information is in this databases online that anybody can go see. Researchers are using this, and conservation organizations are using this massive data set of species observations to help conserve and understand the natural world that we live in.
I had an interview with James Patterson, who's a reptile biologist out of Ontario, and he talked about the fact that it's legit used by scientists. You are actually helping real scientists do their work based on your observations. And I love this idea of getting people, excited about what lands beside them on the path. So for me, when I was a kid, I would have just died to know where owls were in Toronto, because I love owls. I've never seen an owl. And now I can go on iNaturalist and look up owls Toronto, and I see every image of every owl that anyone has captured in the city at a glance. I'm nerding out about it with you here, but that is like just a magical experience and a way of connecting in such a deep way with nature. So you've used these in Bioblitzes, and you mentioned this a few times. So for people who might not know what a Bioblitz is, what is that all about, and how do you get involved?
Yeah, so a BioBlitz is basically, I mean, it can be as big or small kind of event as anybody wants, but it's basically a gathering of people in a specific area, a specific time to record everything they find that's living. So plants, animals, fungus, any species they can find, and it goes into what's called goes into the tally of the species observed at that moment in time. So it's kind of a snapshot of the environment. And that's a great way to kind of, people can connect with scientific experts who can come up as well. And using iNaturalist now, anybody can contribute as an expert. So as I mentioned, if you can take a picture with a smartphone or digital camera, you can contribute to a BioBlitz. And that's pretty much as easy as it is. You upload it through the app or through the website of your photo, and it contributes and becomes part of this tally. And as well, there are experts on iNaturalist as well that can help identify what you've seen to confirm what that observation is. And this data then becomes used for conservation decisions. It can be used to conserve that specific BioBlitz area for future generations.
Yeah. All right, so you've unleashed this horde of Canadians out into the wilds, close to home or a little further afield, to explore the natural world near them. And you highlighted the role that you play in helping protect species across Canada. So what can a Canadian at home? So I've gone outside, I've explored, I now know about this wealth of biodiversity that's nearby. What can I do to protect it? And you give a few options here from sort of the broad Canadian-wide perspective. What can I do to actually help species in their natural habitats?
Well, one way to start, first of all, to learn about BioBlitzes, can check out bioblitzcanada.ca, and iNaturalist, you can check out inaturalist.ca, and that gives you like ideas of how to contribute and how to get involved in either of those platforms. Contributing to like your local biodiversity, like I said, if we can get excited and connected with it, we're more apt to want to conserve it. So everything from your backyard to leaving dead trees that are then can be wildlife habitat, to not raking your lawn so much in the fall to allow some leaf litter for species. And a really big thing, part of our turtle work, is if you're seeing, or keep an eye out, especially for turtles on the roads. In the early parts of summer, you can move turtles off the road if it's safe for somebody to do, safe for yourself to get out of the car and move things, move the turtle off the road. Little things like that seem maybe inconsequential at one point in time, but all these kind of, million acts of conservation can really add up.
That's a great slogan. You guys should use that. It's interesting. Almost every one of the talks has mentioned keeping that sort of not degraded, but like rough habitat, whether it's leaving dandelions in your lawn or leaving leaves raked in the corner, leaving those dead trees. That provides really crucial habitat, food sources for animals. You're the first to mention animals crossing your road. So I've heard it said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you see an animal crossing the road, it's really integral to put it in the direction that it was going, because otherwise it may want to just cross again. Is that true?
Yep, exactly true. We have a video on how to move a snapping turtle off the road, and that's one of the things we highlight, is that make sure you move in the direction it's going. For sure.
Well, I will link in the end of the broadcast 2 Canadian Wildlife Federation's videos. You've produced a lot of them. There's some really top-notch stuff there to encourage people to get out in nature, conservation actions they can do. And so, James, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. I really appreciate this.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.